Welcome to 2 Minutes in the Middle. I'm Craig Huey.
I'm Brandon Koenig.
And I have yet to be counted. I mailed in my ballot. This is Mike McCammon. I think I have been counted. Kansas got it done fast. I mean, those guys were done. Johnson County Election Office was done by about 10 o'clock on Tuesday night. They rocked it.
Super efficient. We're lucky to have the election commissioner we have right now. That would not have been the case under the past election commissioner.
Whoever the person is, they did a good job. I will give them that credit.
How many people live in Kansas?
Millions.
I think if we're going to start with who actually did the counting right, we all have to give a tip of the cap to Florida. After 2000, Florida made changes to make sure that would never happen again. With all of the early voting, with all of the attention on Florida, states like Nevada, Arizona, they need to send somebody down to Florida to see if they can't get some sort of understanding about how to do this.
Yeah, for as large of a state as they are, I mean, Florida gets the counts in quickly. I mean,
it seems. I don't know about Florida, and Brandon, you may know this because you were following this really closely, and I saw this someplace. I just don't have it handy. Of like, what states start counting mail-in ballots before Election Day? And
Florida is one of them.
And I think that's one of the keys. Like, Nevada doesn't start counting until after election is over. So, I mean, they're starting like a week behind everybody else to begin with.
Well, and apparently not only does Nevada start a week behind, they also use an abacus to count these things.
It seems like it. I mean, this is like legendarily slow. And they're saying they're not going to wrap up the count probably until Saturday or Sunday.
Well, and they said they won't be final until the 12th.
Until the 12th, yeah. So they'll get the bulk of mail ballots counted Saturday and Sunday, but there's going to still be provisionals, other ballots that won't get counted until next week.
So, Brandon, you would probably be able to answer this question most accurately, but it feels like if this were any other year with any other sitting president than Donald Trump, they already would have called this.
Agreed. I mean, I think that, and it's obvious where this election is going now. I mean, there's no pathway, but we have an unpredictable president with a result that's just close enough to where he can, spin it and sow doubt and chaos, and he's doing that. And I don't think any of us doubted that this would be the result if it was this close. This was the fear that I always had, that unless it was a blowout win for Biden, we would have these accusations of fraud and illegally cast ballots. I mean, Trump projected this and basically told us this months ago. He said that there is no way he could lose unless it was due to massive fraud.
Yeah, I think let's maybe start here. Let's do what we always do and take all of the warm up and outline we just built and throw that away. And maybe let's start with what's top of mind for me, because it just happened a couple hours ago, was the president's, I'm going to call that press conference, I guess is what we would put that under. We were texting back and forth, and that one, I counted that as Trump's concession speech. You're not going to get a traditional concession speech out of him. He will never say the words, "I lost." I think that's as close to a concession speech as you're going to get. And it's a concession not so much in words as it is his actions, his presentation, his energy level. Everything at that press conference looked like Trump could not wait, not only to get out of that press conference, but to get out of Washington, D.C. Mike, what was your take on that press conference, and what do you think Trump's battle plan is for the next week?
Well, I mean, I think the term that I would use, which fits what you're describing, is I think his mood was rather resigned. So I mean, they are going to fight this stuff in every court, would be my guess that they can. And, we talked about it earlier. I think all of us were hoping for a pretty big win for Biden. So it would be clear that Trump just needs to face the roses and get out of town. But the fact that it's probably going to boil down to one or two states is going to give them a legal path, or I should say confidence that they should go ahead and drag this out and drag the rest of the country through this for a couple more weeks or months while they try to litigate something. So, I mean, it's just, the whole thing is just ridiculous. I mean, the one thing I did think about, just, and I'll let Brandon answer next, but, they were talking on, I was making the observation that I was reading a statistic that like over 30% of Trump's tweets over the last 3 days have been blocked because they're sharing misinformation on Twitter. And it occurred to me that maybe by doing his news conference, he did that because now he can get some stuff laid down to tape that his followers will share that Twitter won't let him do because the broadcast networks let it go. Now, of course, I saw that the three networks cut away. I know CNN and Fox stayed with it, but it just gave him an opportunity to make all these, incredibly false claims. It was who's the guy on CNN? Is it Jake Tapper? Is that his name?
Jake Tapper. Yeah.
He called it pathetic, and I love that word. It was pathetic.
Brandon, I'm going to ask you, do you consider what the president did at that press conference today dangerous to democracy?
I think absolutely, because it's unprecedented. And I don't recall ever having a president who has just immediately claimed that the election is fraudulent, basically calling for votes to stop being counted. I mean, that's just something that you don't do. I mean, the hallmark of our republic is that we count every vote. I mean, that's almost like a slogan, right? Count every vote. You don't just stop legitimate vote counts because you're not winning anymore. And so the idea that he would come out and say that and claim massive fraud with no evidence is disturbing, to say the least, because what it does is it creates an element of chaos. He has supporters that hang on to every single word he says, that are ready to be outside of election offices, banging on doors, calling for vote counts to be stopped. That's already happening in some cases. It's very disturbing. It's very unprecedented. And it was interesting too, because I was flipping through some of the major news networks after the president's remarks, and the stoic faces on many of these newsroom people, I mean, is something that I've never seen before, just because, again, it's how do you react to that? It's not something we've witnessed before.
No, you do what the Republicans have done for 4 years. You simply don't react.
Yeah.
You just pull Mitch McConnell and you say no comment.
Well, and that's what they said most people are doing. I was surprised because I was on CNN that Rick Santorum actually, he says a lot of things that piss me off, but he actually, he made the comment that like what Trump said was wrong. I mean, he actually called him out. And
he did, and he also said that no sitting Republican should defend this, and that they should speak out against that.
But then they also pushed him on who else will come out, and of course, I don't think anyone's going to.
Well, I think, again, I rate courage is directly correlated to the risk involved with it. Rick Santorum has nothing to lose. Politically, he's winning nothing. I don't understand how he cashes a check on CNN. So I guess I give him some credit, but I keep looking for a Republican who has something on the line to step forward. And once again, I'm just lying to myself and setting myself up for disappointment.
Well,
I did see that Mitt Romney tweeted out some remarks about counting every vote. There was a congressman, I think Adam Kinzinger in the House, who did. But most of the remarks I've seen have been made by former elected Republicans, like Senator Jeff Flake, who was a known critic of the president. He came out. And then former Secretary of State James Baker made a statement and came out as well.
So let me ask you this question, Brandon. He's going to lose.
Yeah.
Why? Where is the 2 or 3 brave Republicans that are going to stand out and try to lead the party out of this nightmare to a place where they become relevant again? I guess I shouldn't say that. I mean, they got more votes than Obama did in 18, so I guess it's not, or 12. But I mean, where are the leaders of the Republican Party that don't just stand up and push this thing aside and like figure out how to go forward?
Well, the problem was that this election wasn't a repudiation of Trump. It wasn't a complete rejection. The fact that it was as close as it was, and that's why many like myself wanted this to be an absolute blowout rejection of Trump. So that way it would force Republicans to come to terms with the fact that he was rejected and that they should change course. Unfortunately, I think enough of them have seen from this election that his base and his enthusiasm among his supporters is still very strong. He basically still has almost half of the country with him. And so there is no incentive for many of these hacks and turncoats to change. So instead, they are coming to his defense and trumpeting him, especially those that have 2024 ambitions, because they want to ensure that they remain in the good graces of the movement that follows Trump, that will likely be around. And so that's what we're dealing with now. And anybody who is not aligned with that mode of thinking is cowering in fear and won't come out because of the primary challenge issue.
So I'll go back to my Ben Sasse timeline, because I think this puts all of this, this brings this all home. So Ben Sasse goes along with the president, his entire agenda, says nothing, faces a primary challenger, says nothing, because like you just said, Brandon, he doesn't want to aggravate the base. So he's in Trump's pocket for his primary, gets to the general, thinks Trump's going to lose, comes out and mildly maybe says a few things to try to put some distance between he and Trump. Trump doesn't get blown out, starts doing and saying things that are completely counterproductive to our democracy, the election, and really to the nation as a whole. And Mr. Sasse is quiet again. I think that is every Republican at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I think for the most part, there's maybe one or two voices, I think, from the House, but 99% of them are not speaking up at all, or if they are, they're defending the president.
So Craig, let me ask you this question: if you were going to orchestrate, this gigantic nationwide fraud of the election, wouldn't you try to goose the Senate and get some more House seats out of this and some state legislatures, or would you just focus only on the president and make sure that he loses?
Mike, the international plot to steal this election is too complicated for me to tell you. It's multi-layered, and you're right. We here at the deep state are very specific about when we kind of engage in what our objectives are. I can just say that I'm really glad that
when you put your finger on the scale, you want to make sure you're touching only one of the scales, is what you're saying.
Well, we got really scared in 2016 when Chris Kobach formed that task force to get into corruption, because we thought, oh my God, this is it. After decades of seating the president, I mean, Chris Kobach to the rescue. He's finally no. So once we dodged the Chris Kobach bullet, we just felt emboldened and just went after the president.
I see.
See that I like that question, Mike, because it gave me just another opportunity to make fun of Chris Kobach.
Wow.
But there is some seriousness to that answer. If there was a deep state plot of folks to tip the election away from Biden, wouldn't Kobach have found remnants of that in 2016?
Probably. Now, the thing is that if you were going to do a misinformation campaign, like if you're like a Russian agent, wouldn't you mix the stuff you want in with stuff you don't want just to lower the suspicion level? So by dumping 130,000 votes into Michigan and having only Joe Biden be the thing on it that's kind of like in his favor, that way they would still look legitimate. Does that make sense?
Mike, it's that kind of double switcheroo we're pulling on you there. It's really hard to explain.
I'll tell you, whenever I watch a movie and they do that, I get really confused. It's very hard for me to follow the double switcheroo. I cannot follow
We'll pivot to the election after this, but Karl Rove put out a great tweet today who basically said, hey, a typical recount moves a couple hundred votes. If there were actually a plot to steal an election that you in a state that you had to switch hundreds of thousands of votes or even tens of thousands of votes, he's like, that conspiracy would be rejected for like a James Bond plot. The number of people who would have to go along with it, he's like, it's just not there. Scott Walker, the former Republican governor of Wisconsin, and Brandon, didn't he get recounted twice or three times or something like that?
I think three times, because I mean he had very close elections. One of them, he won in a recall election. He ended up winning a recall election, and then the other two were razor thin margins as well.
And I think he said you can expect a recount to maybe at most move a couple hundred votes. That's all it is.
Yeah.
So, Brandon, we talked about as we was warming up, we would kind of get to what's top of mind for everybody. There's been a lot of information to take in the last 4 or 5 days. Just give me off of the top of your head. What is burning most for you with where we stand with the election right now?
Number one is that I think we've witnessed the death of split ticket voting with this election. Gone are the days when a state electorate might vote for a senator of one party and a president of another. If you look at the Senate results, they adhere closely to the presidential results in each of these states. So there are fewer people left who split their tickets, who are truly kind of down in the middle. I think that what we've seen during the last 4 years is that this intense polarization has really forced people to pick a side and then vote that side down ballot completely. So I think that that's pretty remarkable, because we do have a history in this country of being able to have states vote for a senator of one party and a president of another, as well as governors, and we're seeing less and less of that.
Brendan, let me ask you a question. So when I ran for office, and as I follow the down ballot races, like in the legislature, state legislatures and stuff, with the erosion of print media, it seems like every voter is a low information voter, because it's just so hard to find any information or any credible information that compares candidates. Do you think that what you're seeing is maybe just a result of the fact that because there's so little information about candidates, that people just pull a party ticket, as opposed to trying to take the time to really understand where the issues are and what people believe when it comes to some of these down ballot races?
I think that's definitely a huge part of it. It's basically voter capacity, mental capacity, right, to take in information on all of these candidates.
I don't think it's available. I mean, I used to ask people, I was asking the Star when I ran, like, I would assume there was a time where there was like a Washington beat reporter for the Kansas City Star in DC following around our state legislator to make sure they're doing the right thing. And now they don't have that. So you're basically relying upon the New York Times, and there's no way in hell they're going to follow around the congressperson from the Kansas 3rd District. So there's just no information that we get. And all we get is basically the pummeling of, print advertising, or kind of get out the vote
TV advertising
to kind of get people to go, as opposed to a thoughtful conversation about topics and where a candidate stand on things.
Right. And that's partially due to the fact that news media has downsized so much or consolidated, and particularly when it relates to local news on state, federal candidates that are running on the local level. You don't have that information like we used to. But part of it too is just, I think, with big money in politics as well. And, ever since Citizens United, that has opened the floodgates for all of this advertising. And so people instead get inundated with advertising rather than a legitimate conversation or debate or questioning of the candidates. Yeah. And more often than not, I think people just get turned off by it, and they don't have the time to do their own research. And in some ways, they're dissuaded from doing their own research. And so it's just easier to go, well, I'm just going to go the party line. It'll be easier, rather than actually doing the research on the individual candidates and knowing where they break on various issues.
Right.
So I think what I hear you saying too, Brandon, is if you're going to, as a candidate, if you're going to stop that, you've got to have a really strong connection with the individuals that are voting for you. If you want to break out of that, oh, to hell with it, I'll just vote straight Democrat. I like a couple of people. I know a few of these issues. If you're going to break that model as a candidate, you really have to connect with people.
You really have to connect with people out of the box. You cannot rely on standard television advertising, direct mail. You have to get yourself in front of the voters. I mean, really get out there and make yourself available. And outside of that,
I don't know how you do that. We tried very hard on my campaign to do that, and it was, we sucked. We came in 4th place, got 7% of the vote. Now we only spent 1% of all the money because we didn't do TV and direct mail, and we had a really, it was a completely, for the most part, digital campaign. Trying to basically break through, and maybe we were just 10 years too early, but it was really hard to do that.
And Mike, I think it's a little bit different too. Like in a primary, I mean,
that's fair.
In a crowded primary too, your task was even more difficult because there's all of these candidates running. And so you're competing with bandwidth with multiple people. And I think it's easier in a general where you're in a one-on-one.
That's fair.
So that's probably partially a factor as well.
Thanks for
Mike, kind of same question to you. Sitting right now, and I think I'm looking at the TV here, and I think Georgia just dropped under 2,000 votes for Trump. So
1,900 votes. Yeah.
yeah, so it looks like that's going to happen. Same question to you. Just what's top of mind to you? What's the thing that's in you just keep just flipping over and over in your head about this election and where we're at right now?
Well, I'm gonna just do something funny. Then I'm gonna flip to that question. I have one of my favorite Twitter accounts is the Tweet of God, and they just tweeted an hour ago. You would think people from Nevada would be good at sitting at a table and counting, which I thought was kind of funny.
True.
Anyway, no, we talked about it earlier, and when I've been talking to some of my friends who have family, and even some of my family's friends from central Kansas, what I really see when they kind of zoom on the maps and the states is, what we're really seeing is the difference between, urban opportunity and rural poverty, or rural lack of poverty or lack of opportunity. I think people that don't feel like the prospects are very good for them, they try to find demons, and Trump's narrative really fits for them. And if you're living in some of these other areas, you tend to see the world a little differently, and you may be moved by issues that are different from those. But I think the rural versus urban America is kind of very striking in terms of how the vote, kind of went for the presidential race. Now, I haven't looked at that from the standpoint of what Brandon's talking about of like down ballot, like on Senate races falling aligned. So there may be some mistakes with my analysis there, but rural states elected, rural-facing candidates, and rural states typically voted for Trump and not for Biden.
It does certainly seem that urban America and rural America are. I think we already knew they were moving in two separate directions, but it feels like from a political, economic, and cultural perspective, they couldn't be farther apart.
Yeah, and I don't remember, Craig, where you're from. It's like in Illinois someplace, right?
Yeah, I'm in rural Illinois. I grew up in a small farm town in southern Illinois.
When was the last time you were there?
Year and a half ago.
So you go back. Well, like I go back to where my family lived in a little town called Florence for like 3 generations, and there's nothing there. I'm like, if you live there, you're fucked. You have no opportunity at all. You can be a truck driver or drive an hour to Wichita and maybe work in the air. So I think that people that live out there, I think it's very difficult for them to start worrying about these kind of like top of the pyramid problems that people worry about in the Democratic Party. And I think that's one of the things that the Democratic Party has done to disenfranchise those people, is that basically say that your issues don't matter because we're more worried about a lot of the other issues that we hear about in the Democratic Party these days.
So, Mike, you grew up in one of those towns that as you're driving through it, you lean over to your wife and say, "Where do these people work? What do these people do?
What do they do?"
Because we're miles away from any urban area and anything that we would consider kind of a livable place, but just from an economic perspective. So you're right, and it feels like too is that gap, and maybe I'll ask this to you, Brandon. Can that jigsaw be put back together? Is this just something that's just going to continue, that this growing gap between urban and rural, or what's the path to stop that?
Well, I think it can be addressed. I mean, it hasn't always been broken. So what's broken can be put back together again. And I think partially it starts with, paying attention to these rural communities that are dying and economic stagnation, and having policy proposals that are specifically geared towards them, on being able, whether it's job training, whether it's being able to bring jobs to those communities, but not just kind of giving them up. I think for the longest time, there's been this feeling that both parties have been of the mindset, well, the economy is changing. It is what it is, and you just have to adapt. And many of these people feel like they've just been abandoned. And so they respond to a populist message, even if there's no substance behind it, because it's someone who's finally speaking to them and their needs.
I think what's most top of mind to me is how wrong I've been over the past 3 years. And we can just I'll just dump everything into that bucket. The thing I've been most wrong about for the Trump presidency is for 3 years, I've said there is no way he can expand on what he did in 2016. His personality, his style, his abrasiveness, he just has too many issues working against him to ever really become a mass appeal candidate. He's going to make no inroads with women. Minorities are 100% off the table. There's just no way he can increase what he did in 2016. That was absolutely 100% incorrect. So, Brandon, I'm going to start off with some stats here, and you jump in whenever you want to drill down into one of these. The one that I find most interesting is the African American support for Trump. I looked at some exit polling, and it was up for about 7% from what it was in 2016. Trump may get as high as 15% of the black vote. And I think on our last podcast, I'm like, there's no way Trump gets 15 to 20% of the black vote. That's insane. So he managed to pull 7% more of the African American vote. White women.
Let me ask you this question. So, Craig, do you think some of these numbers that you're going to be reading increasing, it's just his base is increased, and so the percentages are wonky, or do you think there's real shifting going on?
That I think that's the question, and I don't think we know that now. But I don't think you can deny that shifting might be happening. I think it would be the biggest mistake Democrats and liberals can make, as to say this is a mirage, this is an aberration, and we don't need to address these issues. And you can convince yourself too. In the end, African Americans came home and they really carried the election for us. So my fear is I don't want us to talk ourselves into a spot where we don't have a hard conversation about what is our message to our traditional coalition and how do we wrestle any traction the Republicans are getting back away and into our side.
Yeah, and I think, but it is worth talking about, right? Because even small incremental gains, like in African American and Latino support by Trump, have huge ramifications in a close election like this. And it's difficult to understand too, because you have one of the most blatantly kind of racist presidents who engages in dog whistling, and so he's able to increase his support. And the question is, how can that be? I would imagine that if we look at the breakdowns by age and by gender, we're going to see that increase in support is mostly young men, Latino men, African American men, who have responded to Trump's macho complex, machismo. And then, and just, that's something that they find appealing. And there's also probably something there as well. Trump heavily focused on trying to tie Biden to the crime bill of the 1990s and pin blame on him for that. If you're under the age of 40, you're not as familiar with that or being able to go through that nuance, but you hear that and you see what's going on the streets right now and what's happening in America, in police department after police department. So something like that would get your attention if you don't have any context, and you might be susceptible to saying, well, he's kind of speaking my language. This is why we're in the place we are now.
The only way that I can explain that, Craig, is, this is just too much of conspiracy theory, but I really think it's all about just micro-targeting on social media. They basically went out and found some memes that work with a set of low information voters, and they just pounded them with information that was patently false or incredibly misleading. And the example, and Brendan brought this up earlier today, is this example with the Cuban voters, Cuban male voters in Florida, that they basically flooded the airwaves with radio ads that, Biden was a communist and, oh, look what happened in Cuba, kind of a thing. I think maybe they have mastered this micro-targeting. Cambridge Analytica lives on, and there's ways they're using all this information to micro-target messages to people that they kind of get 2 or 3 memes, and 2 days before they vote, and then they just, based upon, they get kind of very, worked up emotionally about something, and they just go and vote on that. They don't go out and look at all the rest of the evidence that, okay, this is a terrible person to vote for.
So, Mike, I agree with that. That low information voters, just blatant misrepresentation of what Biden, what his platform was. That certainly was some of it, but that can't be all of it. Some of it has to be Trump and that attraction to Trump that Brandon talked about. I'll throw this out there. Somebody, I'm stealing this line from somebody because once you hear it, you'll know it's too smart or too elegant for me to come up with on my own. But when we vote in a presidential election, we have a choice between what we want to be and what we are. And when a candidate really wins an election decisively, it's because we see what we want to be in that candidate. That was Barack Obama. So what do we see in Trump? Are we saying that when people voted, because again, yes, Biden is going to win, but Trump had a better night than Biden. And I know that sounds insane as Trump loses, but Trump did some things at the presidential level and downstream nobody thought he could do. So how much of this is America looking at Trump and saying, that's who we are. That's who I am. That's who I identify with.
Well, and I think that there's no denying that. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was done. I get it. The misinformation is there, but usually a lot of people don't vote on policy or information.
They don't. They absolutely don't vote based upon policy. They vote based upon their perception of the candidates. And this goes back to what you're describing.
And who wants to be Joe Biden?
Not many people, I don't. Well, I'll tell you what. The one stream that I really wish the party. Now, of course, I don't know anything about running a party, but I really wish the Democratic Party would have kind of clamped onto this decency thing, because to me that was the message that really appealed to me the most. Is that let's just get back to some level of decency, because right now everything that Trump does is he's just a foul, awful person. So, I mean, to me, that's, now when it comes to Trump, I think what people saw in him is that, he's going to drain the swamp. He's an outsider. Like all of those same narratives where it was like you said, it was the best of same old stuff. That what people saw in him was someone that was, I've heard this from some of our Republican friends, actually one of them, Craig, you and I both know, said that, one of the things he liked about Trump is that he says what he thinks. He speaks his mind. And I like that about him. He's not a politician.
Sure.
Another thing that I hear people say is that they like that he's a fighter. Oh, we like that he fights. We like that he pushes back. Like it's this whole, and that may have been what played well too with some of the minority voters who gravitated towards Trump.
Brandon, Trump got more votes by percentage of all non-whites since I believe like 1970 for a Republican. I think
you have to go back to like Nixon, I think, for that.
He won 36% of the non-white vote total. How? What was the message there? What possibly could be the explanation for that?
I do not have good answers on this because as a traditional moderate Republican, I cannot comprehend how somebody like a Reagan or a George H.W. Bush or a John McCain would not get, increase in votes, but somebody like Donald Trump would, who does everything to be able to lose minority votes. Who, I mean, just it's unfathomable to me. So it doesn't. I was of the mindset that he was going to actually lose from what little share of the minority vote that he had received in 2016. So the fact that he gained on that, I can't. I mean, this is a guy who is going around talking about Confederate statues, keeping them up, and and Confederate flags. And
I know, there is one dynamic here that just to introduce this idea. In my limited experience running for office, I did learn that the people of color segment is not, homogeneous in terms of how they view the world. And in fact, parts of the Black community are actually very, very conservative when it comes to
very socially conservative.
Exactly. And so, there may be a factor, I don't know, but there may be an element of Black voters that live in areas that have been kind of have seen the riots or have been close to, adjacent to the protests and the riots. They're actually thinking that maybe they believe in the law and order message, that they're afraid of their own personal safety. and in hopes that they may gravitate to say, well, Trump's going to at least try to stop this because I'm afraid of my personal safety.
I think we can all agree right now that the Democrats completely miscalibrated their defund the police message.
Yeah,
that was
that played into a lot of local races too, and it hurt a lot of local candidates who had signed pledges to reallocate police funding, because that was spun by Republicans as they're going to defund the police, your communities are going to be less safer. And most of those candidates were then on defense suddenly.
And I heard the anecdote. They say, when you call the police, you want them to show up, like if you and scared people. So,
well, and let's just be honest. Defund the police. That's a white person thing. We completely miscalibrated, I think, how minority communities view police overall in their community, and and what they want out of police. It feels like that slogan and that issue became way more important and way more of a policy we wanted to push to the front to the white electorate than to the minority electorate. Is there truth to that, or am I just talking out of my orifice?
I think there's some truth. I mean, to me, I have been reflecting on that whole issue, and I think the Democrats should have taken a stronger stance. I mean, Joe Biden finally got around to it later, but there was not this immediate condemnation of fighting and how we need to keep order, and that, hey, it's fine if you do peaceful protests, that's fine. But when you start, I mean, even here in Kansas City, we avoided the plaza for almost 2 or 3 months because, we saw that they were tearing up the plaza. They boarded up a lot of the stores, and it's like, that's crossed the line. You can't go there.
Yeah, and I think the whole defund the police argument is frustrating because I think it takes away from the core issue. There's widespread agreement on police reform and getting rid of qualified immunity and having restrictions on the use of force and when it occurs and when you can have raids, daylight versus nighttime raids, like with Breonna Taylor. There's this whole host of policy reform issues that create widespread consensus. And so why you would go to the defund issue, which there is no consensus and scares people, it's just extremely bad strategy. I mean, the fact that became the issue after George Floyd and everything else, rather than some other more amenable reforms, is beyond me.
Well,
completely missed opportunity.
And here, in the Kansas City metro area on the Kansas side, and Craig, you may not remember this. I can't remember exactly the kid's name, but it was probably 4 or 5 years ago. I know the mother of the child. Her name is Sheila Albers, and her son, who was shot and killed by police in his own driveway. And so I mean, the use of unnecessary force by police is something that that's what we should be talking about. We should not be talking about the police. Yeah. All this other crap that kind of got into the, kind of race baited the whole thing. When if you just started talking about the real issue, which is Brandon said, having good oversight, having, not having qualified immunity, like all these really basic issues, you can still be law and order, but get the bad apples out kind of story, as opposed to, well, let's just dump the whole thing and burn everything down.
Let's round out our numbers conversation here. And Brandon, here's some Florida numbers that I thought were really interesting. So Trump won 55% of the Cuban vote in Florida, and he was plus 200,000 in Dade County alone over his 2016 performance.
Yeah, let's talk about Florida for a second. I mean, we all love Florida, obviously, for after these last 2 elections. But really, I think that the story of Florida is Miami-Dade. So Hillary won Miami-Dade by a 30-point margin, and Biden was only able to win it by 7 points. Hillary had a 290,000 vote margin in that county. Biden squeaked out with an 85,000 vote lead. So that is the story out of Florida. Cuban Americans gravitating towards Trump. There were warning signs for the Biden campaign. There was some talk that Biden's campaign reacted too late. You had a Democratic Congress woman in Florida who was very vocal about wanting support for on the ground get out the vote efforts in Miami because she saw what was happening and saw that they needed to energize and get engaged. And because of the pandemic, which I think was a mistake, Biden chose not to have his people canvass in Florida until a month before the election. And Trump's people were canvassing 6 months before the election. So, and then speaking to the propaganda, not only did you have the digital media, which you mentioned, Mike, that was hitting Cuban voters, you had radio ads on Cuban radio stations, an onslaught. You had the Epoch Times, which is a Trump funded newspaper that's just Trump propaganda, that was put intentionally in every Cuban deli throughout the Miami-Dade area. Again, with the message that Biden is a communist, he's a socialist, he's in the vein of Hugo Chavez, you can't support him, that the United States would become like Venezuela and like Cuba. So this message was repeated ad nauseum, and it had an effect. I will say that Biden, outside of Miami-Dade, actually had some success. He won 12 counties to Hillary Clinton's 9 counties. He ended up winning Pinellas County, which is where St. Petersburg is, that Hillary lost. He won Seminole County, which is a fairly conservative county, but it has a high Puerto Rican population. And that Puerto Rican population, it's small in Florida, but it went for Biden. And then Biden ended up winning Duval County, which is where Jacksonville is. So that's been a long time Republican stronghold, but it's been drifting blue because it's very suburban. And so if Biden would have had Hillary's margins in Miami-Dade, coupled with the gains he made elsewhere in Florida, he would have won Florida. The reason he lost Florida was entirely due to Miami-Dade County and that just crushing 30-point margin that Hillary had that he wasn't able to sustain.
Do you think, and I would never question it because I think it was the right thing to do. But do you think that the party's different attitudes toward coronavirus and how that affected canvassing had a pretty big impact too? I guess you were just saying that.
I think it did. I mean, it definitely did in Florida. I've heard that had an impact in other states as well. It had an impact in Texas, where there was some canvassing going on. But yes, I mean, the Biden campaign took the responsible route. They weren't going to canvass. They only changed track, about between 30 to 45 days before Election Day and started allowing canvassers to go out. And Trump's people had been canvassing that entire time. They never stopped. So there's something to be said. I mean, there was that in-person contact that was made, that reinforcement, which also I think played a role. And there's many of these down ballot races too, where I think it especially had an impact because Trump's people were also carrying literature for the Senate candidates and congressional candidates down ballot. Miami-Dade, it's also noticeable that the two members of Congress, both women that had won seats from the Republicans in 2018 in Miami-Dade, both lost those seats this year as well. So they were impacted by Biden's performance top of ballot in Miami.
I do want to, as we pivot out of the numbers conversation, and I think next time when all of this is over, we can certainly put an episode together where we can dive into all of the data, which is going to be fascinating. But as it stands right now, the only group I've heard of that Trump lost ground with was white men. He was -5 with white men. And I think when you dig into that, that's going to be college-educated suburban white men who, Brandon, you mentioned too, there are certain populations that Trump style appeals to. I think that loss of white men is just straight put off by his Twitter account, his style, and just who he is.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think if you look at the county by county level, where you see that breakdown, that's pretty apparent. A good example is right here in Johnson County. Joe Biden became the first Democrat to win Johnson County since Woodrow Wilson in 1916. So over 100 years. That's pretty remarkable. And there's other counties like that where that was the case. Like I said, Duval County is one of those counties. And I assure you that the white college-educated male factor played well there. Duval County is very white. So yes, so I think that where Biden did have success, where he was able to flip Trump areas from red to blue, it was the white educated college male that probably made a difference in those cases.
And another huge mistake that I made during this whole process is I equated money, donations, fundraising to enthusiasm. And Mike, I mean, we made a big deal about Act Blue and that the Democrats had figured out how to raise money at a national level for these local Senate races. What did we get out of that?
They did raise a lot of money. So it was successful. It wasn't, they didn't get the result that they wanted because, for whatever reason. I mean, Act Blue, I don't know, Ben, if you dealt with it at all when you're working in your capacity, but, and I think that Republicans have something similar, but as a candidate, it made it very easy to do online fundraising. And then Act Blue does additional work to obviously raise money for races they want to drop money into during the general. But it was, I think Act Blue, and from a candidate point of view, is a very useful tool. And clearly, they were able to raise a pile of money. The thing that's scary, like they've said, you look at the two races, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham's, they basically just, they still eked out wins. Well, I guess.
No, they didn't eke out wins.
They didn't eke out wins. There was huge wins.
They blew out their candidates.
They blew out their candidates.
Yeah. Carolina, like that wasn't even close. And all the polling had that close. And then he and, Graham wins by 18 points?
Yeah.
Why is that? What do you think about that, Brendan or Craig?
That was a big polling miss. I don't know. So the question is whether it was close and then it just widened in favor of Graham in the final days. That's hard to believe. I don't know what to
does all of this polling. We kind of made fun of the fact that the worst thing you ever want to hear your son or daughter tell you is that I want to grow up to be a pollster. But is it really more that, or do you think it really is the fact that there really are a lot of terribly racist people out there that will never admit to it unless they go into the ballot box? And actually, I heard someone make an analogy today. It's like the person that at 3:00 in the afternoon will drive to McDonald's, drive through, have a Big Mac, throw all the trash away, get home, and then have dinner, chicken and broccoli, tell everyone that they're eating healthy. Is it really?
Mike, this is something I want to push back on.
I'm not speaking from experience on the Big Mac.
This is something I want to push back on for the entire length of however long we do this podcast. Why is voting for Trump make you racist?
I'm just saying it would be hard to be a person that cares about diversity. I think it'd be very hard to vote for Trump.
True. I think that general.
I don't think it inherently makes you a racist. I think it just, but it does. It makes you someone who condones racist behavior.
Boy, that's very politically well said.
And I think
are the polls
we're having now?
What I'm asking is, are the pollsters wrong, or is there really a lot of people that are quietly not on board with? That we should be a diverse country where people have equal opportunity.
I don't know if we can lump all of. I don't know how to argue or to talk about polling and race together. I don't know if any of that intersects. So I'd say let's uncouple that and just talk about polling. Well, number one, I've made an assumption that the polling error from 2016 was identifiable and correctable. Apparently it was not.
Well, they made some changes, but apparently they didn't correct it.
Well, not enough. And there's something else that may play into the polling error as well, which actually plays into a comment you made a moment ago, Mike, about fundraising in Act Blue and whether or not why this fundraising wasn't as effective as it was. So something I completely forgot about that ties into all of this, ties into the fundraising. You're limited what you can do on fundraising when you are not canvassing or you're not out in the communities because of the pandemic. And one of the major things that hurt Democrats, that caused them to suffer, was the decision not to go out and canvass meant that they were not doing voter registration drives. And that is something that they have always been successful in an election year, is registering voters before the deadlines in every state and sending out those grassroots teams and relying on those bulk of new registrations. And none of that was happening. And we know that the Trump team was claiming that they were registering all these new voters. And it looks like that was actually accurate, that they did register all these new voters because Trump grew his base and grew his numbers. And the Democrats were not on the ground registering voters. That wasn't happening.
This would take a long time to know this answer, but I can also tell you from experience is that when you have a competitive primary, that also gooses that voter registration work too, because you're doing it during the primary as well.
As we kind of pivot into our last topic, let me throw this out there. It feels like everything going forward in politics is going to be culture, not policy. Nobody's going to have a serious policy discussion because no serious policy is going to move forward. It's not going to move forward in the immediate future. It would take a paradigm shift of some degree to allow major pieces of legislation to move forward. So if we take that off the plate, that you can't really build a coalition out of policy. Nobody enthusiastically voted for Trump over his tax break or prison reform or trade deals or any of that. This was a straight cultural kind of cult of personality style election. And moving forward, to build your coalition, you're not going to build it around policy issues. You're going to build it around cultural issues.
Personality.
Mike, do you agree with that? And if so, what do the Democrats have to do culturally to get maybe to reestablish themselves with some of those groups that we talked about they lost ground in?
I think they have to find candidates that appeal to more people.
Yep, I agree.
Now, I mean, I think there are exceptions, and I had a conversation with one of my friends today. I think the Democrat Party, the shiny object is always the most diverse person in the room. And of course, you can't discount the progressive movement and how they're able to.
We can absolutely discount the progressive movement as long as it's by Bernie Sanders and that crew. Why should we not discount the progressive movement?
Well, because the youth of the party is really behind a lot of those issues when it comes to universal health care, the Green New Deal, like all those things are very popular among young voters. And that's the future of the party. So, but I think you got to find someone that can appeal. I mean, here's the problem. The Democratic Party likes to have the big tent. It's a diverse set of people. So it's really hard to find a personality that's going to appeal to everyone. You have to appeal to the community that, their number one issue is, equal protection under the law for gay people, and then at the same time is also a strong advocate for race equality, and at the same time that it can also appeal to rural voters. Like how do you find a person that can do something like this?
You need somebody intersectional.
And I'm not a big fan of the man, but I think Bill Clinton kind of did a pretty good job of that. He was from Arkansas, so he had kind of a little bit more of the rural appeal, but he was. I think he was able to cross some of those lines, and the party. I don't know of anyone on the bench right now that kind of can transcend all of those, and along the way bring along the youth vote in the Progressive Party. So I would answer the question briefly that we got to find better candidates.
Brandon, you just said intersectional, and I want to expand on that a little bit, because the Democratic philosophy, or the Democrats' philosophy for building a political coalition, is based on intersectionality. That did not deliver as much as we thought it would on Tuesday. Now, that may be, I'm willing to accept that a lot of this might be because of Donald Trump and the uniqueness that he brings to the table as president. But do you think intersectionality is the way the Democrats should go about this?
I mean, I believe intersectionality as far as having, defining it as a candidate who is able to supersede divides within this country. The whole rural-urban split, the racial split. That was Obama had that degree of intersectionality, right? That's what made him such a compelling candidate and enabled him to win in places like Indiana and North Carolina, and pick up those states, was because he was an intersectional candidate. The problem, though, was that there were no coattails after that. So after the Obama era was over, there was nobody to pick up that mantle.
It was Joe Biden.
Right. Well, you had Hillary and then you had Joe, right? So, and neither of them are intersectional candidates in terms of being able to have that appeal. And most, they are, what's the term I'm trying to think of for a type of acceptable candidates, right? I mean, they're acceptable, but I don't think you would call them intersectional.
So this summer, I think we can all agree that the Democrats' reaction and rhetoric around some of the violence in the protest that may have hurt us on Tuesday night. Brandon, it feels like the pubs are getting razor thin right up to the line, calling for violence. Walk me through the best you can. How does the Republican reaction from the establishment? I'm not counting. Right now, we're in the silly season. Brad Parscale and Richard Grinnell and Lewandowski and Pam Bondi, that will eventually flush out. Once they leave, what do the adults do with this in the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, the adults would be wise to, stamp it out. I mean, it has no place in the party. It's anathema to the American political system. That is a hallmark of our republic, has been that we have peaceful transitions to power at every election. We don't have violence. We don't have disruption and chaos. And so to encourage that or to foment that, it can't be accepted. And we need more than just former party leaders and party elders speaking out, because that's who you see speaking out right now. And those are the people who have nothing to lose. We need the people who have skin in the game, who actually have something to lose, to speak out, because that's what's going to sway minds and allow cooler heads to prevail.
Yeah. I hope we identify those people soon. We're about coming up on our hour here. So any final thoughts before we jump off this? And again, I think next week, after this is over, we can do a huge deep dive into the numbers. But as we wrap this up, final thoughts as we sit here. I keep looking at the TV. The messaging now is Biden is inching closer. That implies that some more data has come in, but it feels like this is inevitable.
It really does. I think with especially when you're looking at Georgia and Pennsylvania, and Trump can try to, sue like crazy all the lawsuits possible, but the writing is on the wall. And so if he chooses to go out kicking and screaming, and there's those in the party that defend him, like, they will be held accountable. And that's not a good look for them. It's not a good look for the future of the party, because again, this election proved that the demographic changes are not quite there yet that we'd like to see. But the fact of the matter is that young people, by and large, will grow older and they will vote in larger numbers. And this is the message you're sending to them. And that's not anything that a young person wants to get behind. Yeah. But two quick things on takeaways from the election. We've talked a lot about the negatives of the election, so I'll start there. I wanted this to be a resounding defeat for Trumpism and what that has done to the world. Instead, we are going to get a change in leadership, thank goodness, but we didn't. It's not a resounding message, and so Trumpism as a movement will survive and will be here for some time, because it has staying power, because half of the country voted in the affirmative and said 2016 wasn't a fluke. This is what we wanted. We've seen what it produces, and we want more of it. On the other hand, you have to give Biden his due. He has the largest raw vote total of any candidate in presidential history. Yeah. And when all is said and done, he will have a larger popular vote margin than Hillary did in 2016 as well. So that's something worth pointing out.
This is a stat you'll like, Brandon. If Biden wins the presidency, he would be the first Democratic president since 1864 to take the office and not hold the Senate and the House.
Wow. I didn't know it went that far back. I figured it went back to like the early 1900s. That's
Yeah.
remarkable.
Mike, we'll give you the last word. What's the craziest thing Trump's going to do in his lame duck session as president?
Um, I can't even predict that. I thought you were going to tell me like what was the. I mean, the one thing I want to go on the record as saying is that for the very longest time I was a big apologist for the Electoral College, and I think it's a good thing, but I'm done with it. I think that it's ridiculously stupid. It doesn't really. It basically what it was intending to do was to give power to smaller states. But what it really did is consolidate the power into swing states, which is different than small. No one's going to come out to California. No one's going to come to Kansas. They're going to spend all their time in Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, or Michigan, I'm sorry. And the Electoral College is just bad. Just count the votes, and whoever comes out on top, be done with it. Because this is ridiculous where we're sitting at tonight. And it could still break Trump's way. I mean, I don't think it's going to, but it still could, which is absurd. No, I don't. I was going to ask Brandon and Craig that question more than myself because I don't know. I mean, do we think that there'll be any widespread violence that breaks out here in a week or two when they finally call the race and the people driving around the pickup trucks with the big flags are going to get out and start doing more shenanigan stuff? Or I don't think they're going to go quietly.
I'm not afraid of that. I'm afraid of he's going to massacre the federal government before he leaves. He's going to fire Esper. He's going to fire Wray. He is going to fire Barr.
I think that's a given. Yeah.
These are givens. He is going to go on a tear of firing people that I read something that it's going to take years to rebuild the federal branch anyway, because it's so understaffed right now. But he is going to just burn it to the ground, I think, before he goes. He's going to pardon some weird folks. He's going to make an executive order that's going to make everybody scratch their head. I said last week, I thought he would, in his own way, accept this because he knows he has to raise money outside of being president to keep his businesses afloat. After what I saw today, I'm changing that. He's going to light a match and burn it all as he goes down, or at least try.
Do you think he'll start his own media company to compete with Fox?
100%. 100%.
Yeah, I mean, he was talking about doing that back in 2016 because he didn't think he would win. I mean, that was on the docket right up until Election Day.
He is going to do that, but he also will file paperwork to run for president 2024 the first day he can. And he will never stop fundraising. He needs hundreds of millions of dollars to stay afloat, and no bank will touch him. The only way he can raise the money he needs is through a presidential run.
I think that there is some truth to that because I could see where candidates that are in a hole would go out and run again just simply to be able to raise the money to dig back out.
And that's his only option to raise money.
Does he go to jail before the 4 years are up?
No.
Does he leave the country? Does he push Ivanka out in front and she runs?
No, I do think Don Jr. is making his
Don Jr. wants to run for the president. Yeah.
And hey, according to Parscale and Lewandowski and Don Jr. and Lou Dobbs and Mark Levine, if you're a Republican wanting to run in 2024 and you're not out defending the president now, you're screwing yourself. Brandon, is that true?
At this point, yes. I mean, anything can happen in 4 years, and we could see the Civil War break out in the party. But based on where the party stands today and the most dominant movement, I mean, yeah, that's why you see these candidates like Nikki Haley and Tom Cotton and Josh Hawley bending over backwards on Twitter defending the president at Don Jr.'s behest.
Yeah.
What about on the D side? I mean, I worry about Biden making it 4 years. Who runs as president in 24 for the Dems?
So let's start with the most logical candidate, which is Kamala Harris. What did Kamala Harris provide during this campaign? I can't think of a single thing. I don't think Kamala Harris really provided much. So, but just by the nature that she's sitting in the executive branch, she has to be the leader. I don't know right now who would come forward, but I do think that Biden certainly is only a one-term president, and we've got 4 years to work that out. I'm just interested to see, do we go politician? Do we go celebrity? Do we fight fire with fire and we just run the rock? That'd be what I do.
Run the rock.
Oh, rolling my eyes.
Logan, run the rock.
If I'm going to give anybody credit who did more than Kamala Harris did for this campaign, it's going to be Cindy McCain, because I'm going to give her credit for delivering Arizona, which could prove crucial. And if for some reason Biden does not pull out Georgia and Pennsylvania, and it all comes down to Arizona, we also need to give credit where credit is due to Omaha and the one electoral vote out of Nebraska that will make 270.
Hey, I always give credit to Omaha. Just want you to know. I want to be on the record. Omaha gets all the love. They have the best zoo in the Midwest.
They do. And I went to school there for 4 years. I mean, it's a great town, but yeah, that
I'm totally joking.
electoral vote.
Nebraska. I was totally joking, Brandon.
If there's a God in heaven, somehow this comes down to Arizona and Cindy McCain and Meghan McCain just double bird and moon Trump as he leaves. Okay, last question, and I promise this is the last one. Does Trump show up to Biden's inauguration?
No,
I don't think he does.
He'll be out. He's got to watch the car.
On that happy note, we'll end there. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Good luck.